Hi there and welcome. My name is Dr. Marlena Jabara, and I'm the proud founder of RadPodSquad. The RadPodSquad Fellowship offers an immersive learning experience tailored specifically to podiatric imaging. RadPodSquad combines comprehensive curricula, cutting-edge techniques, and on-demand access to training that will provide you with the new knowledge and skills that you need to boost your confidence in imaging and truly make a difference in treating your patients. Check us out today, radpodsquad.com. Great. So I'm excited to announce that we've got our YouTube channel up and running, and I'd like you to check that out at RadPodSquad. And at the beginning, I've already got a question. Can you please do a video on edema patterns in the ankle, please? And what we're talking about in this beginning series is diabetic pedal imaging. So I was able to find an excellent case by looking into Collective Minds Radiology, which is something that you'll find when you come to my online fellowship. Essentially, RadPodSquad will use Collective Minds Radiology, has a series of wonderful cases, and you can upload your own cases that become de-identified. And when we look into this case of this diabetic foot, I've already set us up. What we're seeing in this diabetic foot essentially is on the long axis T1 weighted images. We can see that the vector of the talus is performing this medial peritalar rotation in someone that has a severe rear foot varus, a compensatory metatarsus adductus, and that has placed their lateral foot into a supinated position, and they're effectively destroying their fifth metatarsal base that has been infiltrated by this T1 replacement. T1 is the way we're going to make the diagnosis of osteomyelitis, by identifying the complete geographic replacement of the bone marrow. We can appreciate that there's some skin irregularity. Notice that skin is very regular when we look at it everywhere else. And in this location, you can see the excoriation of the surface. And then we can, of course, see that even better on the T2. This area of skin irregularity is consistent with an ulcer. And of course, we can see that so much better when we do a transaxial image through that short axis image through that region of the skin and really appreciate the whiskering. Well, you can see that there's some idea that there's been this infiltration. This is what we saw of that base of the fifth metatarsal. That's that location right there. And when we look at that under T2 weighted images, you can really appreciate the degree of marrow edema, the location and the proximity to the soft tissue ulcer. So in keeping with the question about the different edema patterns, in diabetics, we know that we have several different patterns. Diabetes and the overglycosylation of the neural pathways in our foot can cause a variety of overstimulation of the muscles, which can cause smooth muscle atrophy. That can be a source of why the biomechanics break down. Of course, there are autonomic arterial venous shunting occurring from the small vessel vasculopathy that's inherently marching through this disease. There are a variety of effects on the proprioceptive qualities and abilities of the foot to remove itself from danger. And we get something of a Charcot change, which is that chronic repetitive stress that occurs and creates these situations where I may have trauma to an insensate foot. And when that occurs, I can have ulcers and breakdown as the foot stays in a particular position longer than it should. And the ground reactive forces are basically your foot is pressing into the ground. So when I look at the different edema patterns, I can have diabetic vasculopathy. That's just bland edema. That's just edema that is on the order of, say, like non-cellular, like the difference in the cardiac transudate versus an exudate, that's just a bland fluid region that is not infected. We can have cellulitis, a different reason to have infection, where there's actually infection cells there, and you can deliver contrast and get that to enhance and see the cellulitis enhance. And of course, you can have, with contrast, you can also see an area that doesn't enhance, where you have tissue necrosis. So in fact, you can see bland edema related to diabetic vasculopathy. You can see cellulitis related to infection, and you can see non-enhancement, which may be related to a necrotizing infection or ischemic tissue. So when we look at the T1 weighted images, we clearly see an ulcer. Let's take a look at that ulcer over here. And what we can see on the T2 weighted image is that there is intermediate to elevated signal intensity along the skin in this region. So that could be edema or cellulitis. And now let's take a look at what happens on post-contrast exam. And interestingly enough, on post-contrast exam, we can see that part of the skin is actually enhancing. That's that hyperintense change. And then part of it is not enhancing. Let's take a look at that on different sequences. On the T1, we can see that marrow infiltration. We see our ulcer has this signal abnormality. And when we compare that to something like skeletal muscle, it's relatively isointense. On T2, when we look at the region of that ulcer, we see that elevated signal intensity, and we see obviously the bone marrow edema and the surrounding elevated signal close by. And then on the post-contrast exam, we can appreciate as we go towards the ulcer base, there's an area of non-enhancement seen here. And we can window that a little bit better to bring out the different contrast of the skin that's surrounding this area that is enhancing, that's cellulitis, surrounding an ischemic region of ulceration. So there can be an area of pus. If we look back and we see what this looks like on the T2 weighted image, we see we have fluid and it's not enhancing, so it can be pus that's draining. But when we look at the skin surface that's not enhancing here, we can appreciate the fact that we have a situation where we have necrosis of the tissue in this location. So on this image alone, you can see the cellulitis, the tissue necrosis that's occurring. And if I'm dealing with a situation of diabetic vasculopathy, that's a situation where I might have soft tissue swelling, but then I would have no enhancement in that region. And I just don't have that in this particular case, but I've loaded up some examples of what that looks like. So let's take a look at some things from the literature. When we're looking at these figures here, let's just make this a little bit bigger. Great. And what they're showing us here is on this T1, just like the one I just showed you on a real case, we're seeing this hypointense change in the skin and this change of the architecture consistent with an ulcer. And then on the post-contrast images, we can appreciate the enhancement of this region. That's an enhancing region of cellulitis surrounding the ulcer base. We can appreciate, conversely, in this area where we have this hypointense T1 change on the sagittal T1. On T2, we can see that's hyperintense, but on the post-contrast image, there's no enhancement. So this is a person that has a case of diabetic vasculopathy with just bland fluid that is not infected. And that would be the second figure where we're seeing this subcutaneous edema on the dorsum of the foot, distinguishing it from cellulitis that we see here with the enhancement. So that's an example of cellulitis enhancing in this location and bland edema at the dorsum of the foot. Let's see another example we can see here. In this case, there's a diabetic foot infection and there's necrotizing cellulitis. So let's take a look and see how that looks on axial T1 weighted image. So on T1 weighted image, looking at this location, let's just make this a little bit bigger from Radiopedia. And what we can appreciate is that I have this T1 marrow infiltration along the fifth metatarsal head and likely septic arthritis. I'm appreciating the replacement of the fat at the subcutaneous soft tissues. Taking a look at that on T2 weighted images, what I can appreciate is that there's some intermediate to lower signal intensity. I actually have a greater amount of signal intensity on the opposite side by the great toe. And let's take a look and see what that looks like on the post-contrast T1. And we can appreciate the lack of enhancement of all of these regions here seen on our post-contrast images. And this is a case of necrotizing or necrotic infection. Notice that the cellulitis of the positive enhancement in this location and necrotic tissue in this location lower down, and that dividing line between the enhancing pattern of cellulitis and inflammation with cellulitis and the non-enhancing necrotic tissue. So that's a very interesting case. And when we think about further examples of imaging of the diabetic foot, what we can appreciate in this MRI when we're looking at the different enhancement patterns, that the neuropathic soft tissue edema is essentially not going to enhance in this location where we see that there may be some mild enhancement here. When they actually subtracted the images, there was no enhancement of that particular region that has some amount of edema, and that is going to be consistent with a neuropathic soft tissue edema or bland edema and not related to a cellulitis. On post-contrast, we do not have enhancement, and they show that very well in the subtraction sequence in this location. So this is neuropathic edema as opposed to the inflammation and the enhancement that's occurring throughout the third MTP joint. And this is all osteomyelitis, septic arthritis, and surrounding inflammatory change. But getting back to the ability to subtract these sequences really cleans up these images nicely so that you can appreciate that there was some amount of inflammation on T2, that on sagittal T1, without the subtraction sequence, we can't really appreciate whether or not this is enhancing. But when we subtract those sequences, we can appreciate that there is no enhancement in that location. So this is neuropathic or edema related to vasculopathy and not cellulitis. So that's comforting, and we can use MRI to make that distinction. Here's a great example just from our collective minds radiology, and I hope that answers your question. Are you ready to take your podiatric imaging skills to new heights? Check us out at radpodsquad.com. Explore our online learning community, and don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more enriching content.